Hey, today's weather reminds me of the opening sentence of Neuromancer, which is, "The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel."
I mean, just look at that.
It's a mess. Totally overcast today. I mean, you come out here and it's like gloom just kind of bursts its way onto your consciousness the moment you step outside today. It's just... Anyway, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Euthyphro Dilemma. The Euthyphro is one of the central texts of Plato's early period, in which his BFF Socrates is just about to go into his trial, where he's being tried for being an atheist, even though he isn't one. And he runs into Euthyphro, who is prosecuting his own father for accidentally killing a slave. Now, under the Greek code of morals, to prosecute your own father in a court of law was an impious act. It was sort of a no-no, the wrong thing to do. It's a very traditional type, society. Very patriarchal, you might say. And so Socrates asks, well, why are you doing this apparently impious act? And Euthyphro says, out of piety. In other words, out of respect for the gods, even though the whole society seems to, most of the time, say that that's disrespectful of the gods. So Socrates says, well, you must be a real expert on piety then. If you can say this is pious, you must know what piety is, because better than anyone else. Because most people would seem to say that this is an impious act. And Euthyphro says, why, yes, I know all about piety. My name is William Lane Craig, and I can tell you all about what's pious and what's not. That's Euthyphro speaking there. And Socrates says, well then, what is piety? If you know what piety is, you should be able to tell me what it is. And Euthyphro says, piety, Socrates, is whatever the gods, is doing as the gods will. And Socrates points out, wait a minute, in our stories, the gods are fighting all the time. And so the gods are disagreed about what's good and what's not. And so if the gods are fighting with each other, then something which is pious to one god may be impious to another one. And so, how can we ever tell what's really pious and what's not if piety is whatever the gods will, when the gods' will is inconsistent? And Euthyphro says, oh, well, Euthyphro thinks about that for a little bit, and then he says, well, piety is what all the gods can agree on, which is kind of funny. And then we start to get to a point where we start speaking more generally about the divine, not specifically the irrational Greek gods, right? At this point, the dialogue turns into a discussion of the divine which remains relevant today. Socrates asks the question, which is the Euthyphro Dilemma: is it pious because the gods declare it as pious, or do the gods declare it as pious because it is pious? In other words, is it good because God says so, or does God say so because it's good? Now, logically, it can't be both, because that would be circular reasoning, and you can't do that. So, and if it is pious only because the gods say so, then God or the gods, I'm going to use the terms interchangeably when we talk about the Euthyphro Dilemma, because the logic is the same, no matter which noun you prefer. No matter which theism you prefer, the issue is the same. Anyone who tells you otherwise is stupid, don't listen to them. The issue is the same. Anyway, if something is good because and only because God arbitrarily decided it was going to be good, then God could have declared something else. So that, God could have declared that torturing babies and raping kittens was good. And so that makes God's commands completely arbitrary, completely subjective. Why prefer God's ethics over anyone else's? Might be a reasonable question, if that is the case. On the other hand, it seems to most people, seems to most people that if God declares that it is good only because it is actually good, then we run into a situation where we appear to have a standard of goodness and badness which is in some sense higher than God's, which God is making judgments based on. God would be then appealing to an external standard. Now, this is a problem which has divided philosophers and theologians, for a long, long time. But the way it is generally dealt with is you've got to find a way to say, if you're going to believe in God and you're going to believe in a righteous God and so forth, you've got to find a way to deal with the Euthyphro Dilemma, which enables God's commands, God's judgments on what is good and what is evil to be objective. Hey, that's my roommate. I'm doing this. I don't usually keep this podcast going this long. I've got a long way to walk, so I've got gonna have a long podcast today. Anyway, now the way that this is usually dealt with, and the way that I deal with it, and the way that I think that my faith would deal with it, is, by the way, I might mention what I'm reading, or what I just finished reading. I just finished reading this book, Socrates Meets Kant by Peter Kreeft. I hope that got in the shot. I'm not sure quite what the visual range of this camera is. I'm returning it to the library, so I've got a lot of walking to do. The Euthyphro Dilemma, again, the way that it's normally dealt with is by an appeal to nature. The first and most obvious way to deal with it is to say that God has a nature that determines what God is going to consider to be good and or evil, and that this nature of God's could not have been different than it actually is. Now that, I think, is the start or the basis of a simple answer. I think it's rather too simple, though, because it raises the question, why prefer God's nature over, our nature or any other nature? And that then leads us into the carrot and stick problem, right? If the reason that we follow the commands that God gives based on His nature is hope for heaven or fear of hell, that's just the carrot and stick routine. And that would be the idea of might makes right, or the end justifies the means. Well, of course, sometimes the end does justify the means when the means isn't wrong. But here we've got to find some kind of basis upon which to prefer one ethical system to another. Excuse me. That gives us a bit of a meta-ethical problem, because the whole idea of one preference being right and another preference being wrong is what ethics is, right? So in saying one ethical system is better than another, you're really judging the two of them by a third standard, right? So somewhere along the line, you've got to make an assumption. If you're going to do ethics at all, you've got to make an assumption somewhere that there's an ought. This ought to be done. You have an obligation to do such and such. And somewhere that has to be in your first principles, because any argument for it conceals, I'm going to have to get into the is-ought problem another day. Anyway, God's nature, being it, isn't enough in itself, because that doesn't supply us with a reason to prefer God's nature over any other nature. But here's the issue. Now, this is going to sound like an attempt to have your cake and eat it too, and it very well might be. Let's see if I can get away with it. First of all, right consists in a relationship between the action and the nature of the things acted upon, and the nature of the actor, right? Right consists in a relationship between, or concerns a relationship between the nature of objects and actors and actions that actors make upon objects, right? And if that is the case, then God is in a much more favorable position, because God created all of the objects. So when we talk about natural law theory, when we talk about the laws of nature and nature's God, God created those. And it's important to understand what is involved in the doctrine of creation. Creation, for God, means creating something which is separate from himself, which is an other, which has a kind of independent existence. Now, it's not an independent existence in terms of power. It may take God's continual power to keep the thing in existence, but it is a metaphysical independence or separation that we're talking about here. Once having created something, no one can have it both ways. You can't both do something and not do it. It is just as impossible for God, as for the weakest of his creations, to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives. So, once having created something that has a nature, God does not any longer have the power to uncreate it. It either uncreates itself or it continues to exist, period. Because if if God uncreates it, that would mean God never created it in the first place. Right? There's no undo button for God. Right? No Control Z. God's freedom consists in one single, indivisible, eternal choice: to exist. Beyond that, everything else that has happened, which we've observed God do, follows. Right? God made a commitment to be God, and that means to be the sort of God that He actually is. So, this deals with the apparently arbitrary nature of God's nature. Right? What it basically means is one of the ways to deal with the arbitrariness of God's nature, the problem of that, is to imagine a shadow world, an alternative, imaginary reality in which a different sort of God exists, one who declares that it's righteous to torture babies and rape kittens. Okay? One who says that good is evil and evil is good. One who is completely morally reprehensible. Now, we find that in literature. We find that sort of thing happening in literature. It happens in the book Huckleberry Finn. Huck is trying to help an escaped runaway slave named Jim, trying to help him along the Underground Railroad to get into the North to escape slavery and find freedom. But Huck lives in a culture which says that this is an unrighteous act, a culture which says that God has declared slavery right. The culture of the pre-Civil War South. And Huck isn't an educated person. He doesn't understand ethics or theology or any of that. He has no intellectual weapons with which to fight this argument made to him by the preachers of his society, who, by the way, were charlatans. But Huck has no special inspiration with which, or education, or intellect, or logic, or anything with which to fight the apostate preachers of his society. So what does he do? Actually, I probably go the wrong way. I probably need to go this way. What does he do? He's facing what seems to him the very real possibility that if he's going to help Jim escape slavery, he could burn in hell for it. Because God might not approve of what he's trying to do, even though, in his own estimation, according to his own conscience, what he's doing is right. Now, Huck makes what I consider to be the right choice, which is to do what he knows is right, not what some preacher tells him is right. He decides, even if the preachers are right about the theology, he doesn't know the terms, so he doesn't quite say this. I'm sure probably Mr. Twain, Mr. Clemens knew the terms, but he has to put it into the mouth of his character without actually using the terms. But basically, let me intellectualize what Huck's problem is. Huck decides the preachers might be entirely right about the theology and the cosmology and the afterlife and all that stuff, but they're wrong about the ethics. Because Huck can tell slavery is wrong, that Jim deserves to be rescued from it. And so he makes a decision that he's going to do what he knows to be right, no matter the consequences. That Huck is doing what I believe God's ethics are really about. It's a relationship between an actor, him, who has a moral obligation to justice and so forth, against an object, which in this case is sort of another person. The nature of the object of his action is another person who has the same rights that he has. And the nature of his action matches the values of himself and his object. So he's doing what's right. He's not responding to the theological mumbo-jumbo behind which we disguise the ideas of nature, but he is responding to the actual nature. Huck Finn responds to God's actual nature, not to the fallacious version he's been given so far. Anyway, I'll talk more about this tomorrow.